Thank you so much, Lynn, and thank you so much for having me come and speak to you. I'm so impressed with how many people are here today. I really appreciate that. So let me get my liquor. What I wanted to focus on today is a seminal book that was published in the 1920s called The Trail Drivers of Texas. And as I talk about it, you will realize why I chose this subject. It's close and dear to my heart. So at the beginning of the trail drives, why were there trail drives? At the end of the Civil War, Texas was devastated, both spiritually and most importantly, economically. Luckily, Texas had one resource that the northern markets desperately needed and wanted. It was not black gold, not oil, but instead it was cattle. After the Civil War, northern markets were in need of beef. So Texas realizes we have this great resource, but we need to get it to the northern markets. So how do we do that? That's where Cowboys came in. The Texas Cowboys drove their herds to Kansas over the open plain, taking 3 to 5 months. And it was there that the cattle were then loaded onto railroad cars to go to different markets in Chicago and into the Northeast. An estimated 25,000 to 35,000 men drove 6 to 10 million head of cattle up trails such as the Chisholm Trail and the Western Trail. This all occurred from the end of the Civil War around 1866 to around the early 1890s. It ended when barbed wire was invented. All of a sudden, the ranchers were fencing off their land, and so the open land that you needed to drive this many cattle was beginning to be closed off. And that in itself was very devastating for the market. In fact, they even had little battles and skirmishes because of barbed wire, and the Cowboys came to call it the Devil's Rope. This brief moment in time, maybe 25 years, would have this lasting impact on not only Texas culture, but American culture and our ideal of our American identity. It is this time that the mystique of the American cowboy began. So who were these cowboys who went up the trail? Well, a good many of the cowboys were teenagers. They could be as young as 13 and 14. They looked to be hired onto the cattle drive not only for the pay, but they were looking for the excitement and adventure. What teenage boy doesn't want to leave home and be out on the trail for 3 to 5 months? But it was hard work, and it was drudgery, and it was very dangerous. But despite this, for many of these cowboys, as they became older, this long trip across the prairie behind a herd of longhorns became the most unforgettable experiences of their lives. And if I may, I'd love to read to you one of the accounts that one of the cowboys wrote. So in Matt's stories, his account, he recalled one particular drive. And I would like to read it to give you an idea of what it was like to go on this drive. We had no serious mishaps until we reached Onion Creek, where we had a storm and a stampede. We counted the next morning, and we were out over 300 cattle in the mountains and in the mud. But we soon gathered them all in and moved on, getting out of the brush at Burnett, where we rested half a day. On to the Red River. At the Red River Station, we had a stampede one night, which was caused by a panther coming into the camp and getting some fresh beef we had on the line. On we went to a little creek 3 miles south of the Washita River. That night we had an awful rain and had to move to higher ground. We devoured all of our grub there. And the next day we started to cross the stream while it was on a big rise. And as soon as our loose horses and pack mules struck the swimming water, they tore downstream. Being nearer to them, I jumped my horse into it, but he did not try to swim a lick. So I floated out to a sandbar on the other side and lost my saddlebag and all of my clothes except for the ones I had on. When we reached the Washita River, it was also on a rampage, and we decided to wait until the next morning to see if the stream would run down. But the next day, it was higher than ever, so we roped logs that were floating down the stream to construct a raft. While doing so, Billy Gray roped a large treetop and it pulled him into the river. As he could not swim, I threw him the end of my lariat, and thinking he had failed to catch it, I plunged into the water to go to him, still holding my rope. Before I came up, I felt him pulling on it, and when I again saw him, he was overhanding the rope about 10 or 15 feet from me. So I caught a willow limb. By the time he reached me, caught me around the neck, he dunked both of us. I held onto the limb and he to my neck, and we got out all right, but I lost my lariat. They loved it. It may have been hard for them while they were experiencing it, but as they grew older, they only had fond memories of those types of adventures and dangers. Years later, their memories of crossing the raging rivers, controlling the stampedes, protecting cattle from wild predators, and braving the elements, this became part of that cowboy mystique. As the Cowboys grew older and wiser, they would often get together at Old Settlers Reunion, county fairs, family reunions, anywhere where they could get together and share stories and memories. But as they died off, this history was beginning to disappear. This is where George Saunders comes in. George Saunders, a San Antonio cattleman and a veteran of the cattle trail himself, knew he needed to capture this history. So he established the Old Time Trail Drivers Association in 1915. This new organization gave these remaining cowboys a place to come and fraternize and be a part of a special brotherhood. It was at their annual reunions that members kind of had a sense of community and a family and a place to reminisce with other cowboys who experienced this once-in-a-lifetime experience. The association proved to be very popular. In 1915, in its first year, it had 375 members. By 1921, the membership was over 1,000. So George Saunders had caught on something that needed to be done. So at the annual convention held in San Antonio in 1917, George Saunders revealed his plan in front of the 700 to 800 trail drivers who were present. He wanted to compile and publish a book based on the recollections of the members. So he had already been soliciting stories for about 2 years before this convention, but he wanted more stories. So the audience, needless to say, was very excited to add their memories to the book. But problems with the project started from the very beginning. He had hired an editor who had great credentials. It was A.C. Williams of Fort Worth. A.C. Worth. He was the assistant secretary of the Cattle Raisers Association of Texas, and he was an editor of a trade journal, The Cattleman. What more could you ask for in an editor? But unfortunately, Worth was unable to complete the project. It was later said that he had a nervous breakdown while working on it. So he was without an editor. Then the printer that Saunders had found in San Antonio went bankrupt. Not only did they go bankrupt, but they also stole the manuscript. that Saunders had given them. And then World War I broke out. So what more could go wrong? But this did not deter George Saunders. At the 1920 reunion, he came back and he started telling people, I'm going to have a volume ready in August, just 3 months away. It's going to be 500 pages. Put in your order right now. So he was very confident that he could actually get this project going. But he needed a new editor. So this is where J. Marvin Hunter, the founder of the Frontier Times Museum, comes in. Saunders knew about him. Hunter at the time was a very famous newspaper man, and he was also an amateur historian. And he had written already about cowboys and Old West history. So Saunders goes to him and says, I need an editor, but you have 3 months to finish this project. So needless to say, Hunter was a bit hesitant, but it wasn't so much just the time limit. There was also another major reason why Hunter didn't want to take the project on. He wrote, I have been handicapped in several ways, chiefly because I was never a cowboy. I never put a rope on anything larger than a milk calf, never rode a yearling, I never forked a bronco, or adorned my boot with a pair of cornbread spurs, which is a term I have not heard before. And it is only by accident am I entitled to membership in the Old Trail Drivers Association. Sometime in the remote past, my father, John Warren Hunter, helped to keep up the drags with the herd going north, and therefore he made me a son of a trail driver. So he didn't feel like he actually belonged to the group, even though he had the connection through his father. But he realized how important this project was to documenting not only the history of the cowboy, but also the history of Texas. He would later write, the time was right for its publication, as the older fellows are passing off the stage of action at an alarming rate, and that within a few years, not many would be left to tell. So they were up against losing the people who actually lived this experience and who actually went up the trail. So the work begins. So not only was the time schedule incredibly tight, but Hunter and Saunders, when they first started, really just did not have that many firsthand accounts to work with. Even though the cowboys at the conventions were very enthusiastic and wanted to be included, they were actually pretty slow to actually turn in their written narratives. And so Saunders found himself having to bug the cowboys through telephone calls, telegrams, whatever, letters, whatever way he could to push them to get their stories in. In the meanwhile, Hunter worked to find a new printer, and he was editing the stories that Saunders were bringing him. And then he also had to edit what the manuscript the printer was printing out every day. So he was under an immense amount of pressure. He was working every day on this. He was sleeping maybe 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night. But amazingly, he managed to get it all done and turned in the manuscript, a completed manuscript, by July 21st, 1920. And for his efforts, Saunders paid him $500, which I could imagine was a pretty good sum in the 1920s. So the book is completed. Very successful from the very beginning. About 1,000 copies were printed for the first edition. After it was so well received, an additional 500 copies with new stories was printed in 1923. By this time, Hunter had moved to Bandera, had opened up a printing shop, and had his own line of type machine. So he was the printer of the second volume of new stories. But he hated it. He later wrote that he printed the second volume. It was too crudely done. He was under too much of a time pressure, again, from Mr. Saunders. And he said it was probably the piece of printing I was always ashamed of. So he didn't want to leave the volume at this last volume as the last edition of the book. So in 1924, they worked to correct and revise a version of both the first volume and the second volume. In 1925, the two volumes were combined into a single volume of 1,060 pages. So it was quite the undertaking. This was professionally printed by Cokesbury Press of Nashville, Texas. And if you find a copy of them, they're very rare and very valuable. And inside it's listed as the second edition revised. Since then, the Trail Drivers of Texas has been reprinted several times. I believe it's in the public domain. The University of Texas actually reprinted it, and they reprinted it based on this second edition. And that's the one that you'll see out on the market today. So who told their stories? So as many as 6,000 former drovers may still have been living at the time the Trail Drivers was being prepared. And the Trail Drivers Association had more than 1,000 members. There's only 350 individual stories that were included in the final publication. This, to me, is indicative of how difficult it was to gather these first-person accounts. You know, it's one thing for an elderly cowboy to sit around the campfire, drinking a couple of shots of whiskey, talking to his friends, to talk about his reminiscence. It's another situation to have these same stories actually written down in a more formal way. So of the 350 narratives, less than half the stories that are in the book actually are about going up the trail. So the number of accounts, most of the number of accounts relate adventures of living on the frontier, but they don't actually touch on driving cattle up the trail. By far, the most number of the entries were actually written by J. Marvin Hunter. So at the end of the day, Mr. Hunter was a promoter. He was a businessman. He wanted to sell books. So he wrote a lot of the accounts that you'll find in here. He sprinkled cowboy poetry throughout the book, and he included stories that he thought the readers would be more excited about, like stories of Indian raids and outlaws. So the title is a little bit disconnected to what the project started out to be, was a little disconnected to the final product. But there's still history there. So how accurate is this history? So to begin with, the Trail Drivers, the actual book has many omissions and some inaccuracies. Brian Price, who was the curator at the Panhandle Plains Museum in Canyon, wrote the introduction to this book, and he does a very good job analyzing the content of the book. He cautions the reader and the scholar not to depend too much on the book as a historical resource. One glaring lack of omission is there's very few stories about cowboys of color, despite the fact that 25% of the cowboys who went up the trail were black, where many were freed slaves. Mexican cowboys were also invaluable to these herds, to driving the cattle up the trail. And they accounted for about 15% of the total number of cowboys who went up the trail. So if you combine those, about 40% of all cowboys who drove cattle were cowboys of color. But there's little attention made in the book for this segment of cowboys. They're rarely mentioned by name, and with just a few Hispanic cowboys and only one black cowboy, George Glenn, playing any type of prominent role in any of the narratives. So you have that glaring omission to the history of the Trail Drivers. There's also factual errors and inconsistencies when they talk about the trails themselves, particularly the Chisholm Trail. The inaccuracies were so bad that J. Frank Dobie at one time called it chaotic, how they characterized the cattle trails. But despite these shortcomings, the book does offer very insightful glimpses into trail life. And if you just read and examine the actual narratives, you do see a profile of the cowboy emerging. You do get a true sense of what they experienced. So it's very important in that regard. So when looking at the stories of the real cowboy, you start seeing that you start looking at what's fact versus fiction. Nearly 60% of the first-person narratives, they mention a year of birth, so you get a sense of the ages of those who went up, and nearly 40% list a birthplace. So you get a sense of where were these cowboys coming from? They weren't only coming from Texas. There were many young men who went to Texas to work on the trail drives. They were coming from a lot of the southern states, as far away as Ohio, Missouri, but there were also some foreign-born cowboys. A lot of cowboys came from Germany, the Scandinavian countries. Within the narratives, there's 4 cowboys of foreign-born birth from Germany, France, and Poland. So it does give you a sense of who the cowboys actually were. Hollywood has given us this image of these older, cranky cowboys who have spent years on the trail, and that just wasn't the case. Most of them were very young men. C.W. Ackerman, one of the trail drivers, recalled that on his first drive to Kansas in 1873, the oldest man on the crew was 25 years old, while the rest of them were between 18 and 22. So nearly half the cowboys who submitted their first-person accounts to the publication, 3 out of 4 of them went up the trail for the first time between the ages of 16 and 22. 20% may have been a little bit older, but 6% who went up the trail were actually even younger than 16. So a lot of these trail drivers, they began working cattle at home on the ranch. One, A.D. McGee, he actually drove from Belton, Texas to Abilene in 1868 at the age of 11. So they could be very young. And it makes sense. The life and the work on the trail were so hard, you almost need to have young men doing it. And young men who could endure this type of hard work and danger for that 3 to 5 month period and traveling anywhere from 15 to 25 miles a day. It was a young man's job. But what about the Cowgirls? We always hear about cowboys. So what about the Cowgirls? Well, this is where George Saunders really did not. He was actually very good about recognizing the contribution of women to the cattle industry. There's several accounts of women going up the trail are included in the publication. There's one that I absolutely love. It's from Samuel Dunn Houston. He was a relative of the Sam Houston. He recounts the story of a girl who dressed as a man and who joined his crew for 4 months in 1888 on a drive between New Mexico and Colorado. And if I may, I'd like to read that account. So he had hired a young man named Gus Bertal. Gus had come up to him after dinner. He called him the kid. So Gus must have been very young. After dinner, the kid came to where I was sitting and asked me if he could quit. He insisted, said he was homesick, and I had to let him go. About sundown that evening, we were all sitting around camp, and the old herd was coming in on the bed ground. I looked up toward town and saw a lady, all dressed up, coming toward camp, walking. I told the boys, we're going to have company. I couldn't imagine why a woman would be coming on foot to a cow camp, but she kept right on coming. And within 50 feet of camp, I got up to be ready to receive our guests. Our eyes were all set on her, and every man holding his breath. When she got up within about 20 feet of me, she began to laugh and said, Mr. Houston, you don't know me, do you? Well, for 1 minute, I couldn't speak. She reached out her hand to me, and I said, Kid, is it possible that you're a lady? That was the one time that I could not think of anything to say, for everything that had been said on the old cow trail in the last 3 or 4 days entered my mind at that moment. So you can imagine he's thinking about what they were talking. In a little while, we were all crowded around the girl and shook her hand, but we were dumbfounded. We could hardly think of anything to say. Well, she said, I will tell you all about it, Mr. Houston. My papa is an old-time trail driver from southern Texas. He drove from Texas to Caldwell, Kansas in the 1870s. After I was 10 or 12 years old, I used to hear Papa talk so much about the old cow trail, and I made up my mind that when I was grown up, I would hit the trail even if I had to run off. I had a pony, and I read in the New Mexico paper that a big herd was passing close by. So I said, now is my chance. I had my brother's clothes and a pair of his boots. In 4 days, I was in Clayton looking for a job. Now, Mr. Houston, I am glad I found you, and I'm glad you hired me for the trip, for I have enjoyed it all. So, good for her. Other accounts were women whose husband would maybe have been the trail boss. One particular one was Amanda Burt of Cotulla, and who provided a detailed trip. She actually went along the trail riding in a buggy, and one of the cowboys actually talked about how that was on his first trail drive. She was there, and she kind of looked out for him, you know, being very motherly and very protective of him. And for years afterwards, he admired her and knew that it was only because of her and her protection and her encouragement that that's what made him be able to finish the trail drive. So that those were also the ones that they accounted. So American Manifest Destiny, that's what we look upon our cowboys to achieve. George Saunders wanted the trail drivers to preserve the role played by these cowboys in fulfilling the manifest destiny of our country, to expand and develop from border to border, from coast to coast. He wanted the book to not only be memories of the trail drivers, but he wanted to serve a purpose. He wanted it to be a counter narrative of how, because at that time, cowboys in popular culture in Hollywood, they were being portrayed as outlaws and criminals and a bit wild. George Saunders wanted to counter this narrative and portray cowboys in a different way. He vigorously defended the cowboy as generous, brave, and ever ready to alleviate personal suffering and share his last crust, his last blanket, and often more importantly, his canteen, because they were good men. And he also pointed out that only a small percentage of those who went up the trail later became outlaws or became criminals. That for the most part, these were really good, hardworking men of good characters. So how should we look upon the legacy of the trail drivers of Texas? How do you look upon it as a historical resource despite its shortcomings. Person narratives that are based on memories. It's very important that as genealogists and historians that we realize that memories can tend to be more sentimental than accurate. The author, Don Walker, said it best. When he compares a sense of the past is different than a sense of history. And when looking at the trail drivers of Texas, he cautioned that what purports to be history of the trail and ranch life is often selective nostalgic memory. The elderly drovers indeed may have felt sentimental at the time that they were asked to write their memories down, even though that this time of their life in actuality was a pretty grueling life. But if you think about when these memories were written down, it's at the first part of the last century. They were witnessing in real time a passing of an ideal version of the country as the country became more industrialized and more developed. C.H. Rust of San Angelo, who drove cattle up the trail in the 1870s, he probably said it best. I turn my face west. I see the setting sun, but I do not hear the echo of, "Go west, young man, go west." I turn my head east, and I hear the dull thud of the commercialized world marching west with a steamroller procession to roll over me, to flatten me out. How sad. I mean, I think that quote captures what these men were feeling. Their way of life was gone, and they knew it. So if they were sentimental in remembering it, God love them. I think we need to understand that and appreciate it. To me, this leads us to look at our own experiences, the experiences that we're living today, and it makes us wonder, how can we capture our history for our family and for future generations that will come after us? Despite the turmoil of what we're experiencing today in the world, we have to appreciate that we too, all of us, are living in this incredible moment of time. How many of us kept a journal during the COVID pandemic? And is it also time to be doing oral histories of those who lived in our more recent history, such as the Vietnam War or the war in Iraq and Afghanistan? You know, we often hear the question, where were you when President Kennedy was assassinated? Now we have a whole generation of Americans who are adults that were not alive on September 11th. So we should be asking ourselves and answering, where were you on 9/11 before these memories are lost? So we need to think seriously about capturing our history, whether it's through journals or conducting oral histories. If we do it now, perhaps we could eliminate some of that sentimentality that George Saunders and J. Marvin Hunter faced when trying to preserve the history of the trail drivers. But despite the shortcomings of the book, many scholars view the trail drivers as one of the finest works produced on the cattle industry. There's a lot of stories about not only the cowboys who drove the cattle up, but the businessmen who kept the cattle industry going and who helped Texas recover after the Civil War and helped Texas become the state that we are now. For J. Marvin Hunter, he recognized the endeavors of George Saunders, and he concluded the book by writing the very last, The old-time trail drivers, as well as the youth of Texas, owe him, George Saunders, a debt that can never be paid for thus rescuing from oblivion and preserving this important link in the chain of Texas history. So as genealogists and historians, it is now our responsibility to capture and record our history as part of the larger history of Texas. Thank you. Were there any questions or? Yes, sir.